Welcome to Hope Through Hard Stuff, a podcast from Winning at Home. Please welcome your host, speaker, and award-winning author, Steve Norman.
Welcome back to Hope Through Hard Stuff. I'm really excited to have as my guest today a friend, Joel Schoon Tanis, who is just a phenomenal all-around person, but a really gifted artist. I met Joel initially through his works that were passed along to me by my sister Sue, who was a classmate of Joel's back in the day at Hope. So, Joel, thanks so much for your time, man.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. I like talking to you, Steve, and we'll let some people drop in on our conversation.
Yeah, it sounds like a plan. Joel, tell me a little bit about how you got just your start in creative endeavors. Like, when did you know you had an itch just to give birth to images and sounds and words that would be life-giving to other people?
Wow. So I'm going to give you two different answers.
Okay.
The first answer is I was always the kid that liked to make things.
Okay.
So when I was a little kid, for Christmas, for birthdays, I asked for art supplies. I just always liked to make things. So I've always had an itch to be creative. And then, I went to college, went to Hope College with the intention of studying art and other things, because no one tells you can be an artist. And so even though I sort of deep down knew I wanted to be an artist, I took communications classes and English classes and all these other things, thinking, maybe there will be something else in there. But I did go off to college pursuing art as a piece of it. And pretty early on in college, I just gravitated towards color and whimsy. And I just always liked making people smile through art. And then a year out of college, I had spent a year working in an art gallery. I took the plunge, and I've been a full-time artist ever since.
So, Joel, talk about what were some of those early images that people tended to resonate with? Like, how did you know that if your intent was to make people smile, that you were connecting with people on that level?
My senior year in college, I was taking a watercolor class, and I was painting really mediocre, bland watercolors. That's one piece of the puzzle. Next piece of the puzzle is a friend of mine was student teaching, and she asked me to come do a little art project with her students, and I did. And there was a kid in that class that really loved doing art. Next thing you know, this child came with my friend to my studio at college, and we painted together. And at the time, I was painting really abstract artwork. But I let this young girl go first, and she painted these big sailboats, and as a kid would, but larger than life, because I gave her a really big canvas. And then I took that canvas and I turned it into an abstract painting, but with these kid images floating through it. And I thought, that's interesting. So then I took the stack of watercolor paintings I had that were boring and bland, and I started scribbling little kid images over top of it, just with pencil. I'm like, this is more fun. And I started exploring this sort of kid-like lens through my art, and I've been doing that ever since. So as I started to show my artwork, not all my work had the kid-like things, but all my work always had whimsy to it. So as I was right out of school and I was showing my work, it was colorful, and a lot of it had this kid-like element, and then some of the things that weren't kid-like still had whimsy to them. Like one of the first paintings I ever sold was called 5 Cats and a Mouse, and there were 5 cats lined up, and of course there was no mouse because it had been eaten. There's just like little funny things like that. As things progressed, I would do an art exhibit at different galleries. I started growing in my ability and in my representation. So I showed in galleries all over the country, and I would do a show, and at the opening, they'd just turn into these really fun parties because people would come and chuckle, right? Or smile and start comparing what they're seeing. And, you get enough people in a room all enjoying themselves, it sort of spreads. So early on, I gravitated toward things that make people smile, and got sort of instant gratification from it, because just the nature of how the way I showed it, I got a lot of immediate feedback for it. That was a long answer.
No, it was a great answer. But so not to stereotype artists or art galleries or the art scene, but that seems really kind of countercultural to much of what is out there. Am I reading it wrong?
No, you're not reading it wrong. So first of all, let me just say, when I was a freshman in school, my main art professor took my black paint away because I was doing moody art major things. And he forced me to do colorful things and shade and whatnot with color instead of gray and black. And so he also helped push me in that direction. So I just want to get that one in there. Just I had mentors along the way that recognized that I was wired to do these more joyful, colorful things. Mm-hmm. That said, not the whole art world resonated or thinks that whimsical artwork has the same legitimacy.
There's a perception that it's lacking in gravitas. Like it just doesn't have like weight of quote unquote real art.
That's right. And I like to give the example of, when like a comedian like Jim Carrey or Adam Sandler does a serious movie for the first time, they do a drama, and people are like, I can't believe he's such a good dramatic actor. And that's incredible. Who knew? And I always want to say, well, I knew. You can't be whimsical. You can't be funny without having a certain amount of sense of the world. Like it's a skill set that takes developing. It's just a different way to deliver ideas, and it does take skill. But just throughout the arts, whimsy is not embraced in the same way. So so I have bumped against that along the way for sure.
So Joel, that's art as joy. Let's talk about art as worship for a moment, because again, you and we're broadcasting from West Michigan, and although it's not part of my backstory, it's part of yours. Like these deep, beautiful Dutch Reformed roots that we cherish, and there are a lot of good things from, and yet in kind of the Reformed vein, or at least the American puritanical vein, there hasn't been a deep appreciation for color or wonder or art like there is in some other theological traditions.
Right. Yeah. Right. So here's my next strike. So the other thing is I did start exploring my beliefs, my faith through my artwork. I will say it started almost by accident, not that I wasn't a believer, but I love painting animals and kid-like things. And so the natural entree for me was Noah's Ark, right? So I started painting Noah's Ark paintings, just fun, silly ones. But then I started exploring other biblical stories, and it kept going. So now I've got biblically inspired artwork. I've got whimsical artwork. I don't fit anywhere because now I'm even less likely to fit in an art gallery who, that isn't sure about whimsy to begin with, and then you throw in faith-based things. But then also on the flip side, as you just pointed out, churches didn't know what to do with me, because I was taking biblical stories and rewriting them from a kid-like perspective, adding some whimsy in. It's like, is he early on, before people knew more about me, they're like, is he making fun of this? Is he making fun of scripture? And so it's funny to think back on that. I've been doing this long enough now, and while I still bump into a person from time to time that's maybe not encountered me and needs to work it through, luckily I have enough years of experience where people know better. Some of those early days exploring those sorts of things were really funny. I didn't have a home in the sort of general market or in the more church world. And a lot of churches, luckily this is changing, but a couple decades ago, imagery in churches it wasn't happening. The old school churches didn't do it because of the sort of Protestant thing that you mentioned, but then the new sort of mega church or modern seeker churches sort of kicked all imagery out because they didn't want to scare off newbies who even crosses and certain symbols got removed from a lot of those spaces because they didn't want to spook anybody who didn't understand what those things were. And so Yeah, I was a little bit homeless in certain situations.
Was it ever discouraging, Joel? Because it would seem like if, hey, I've got this theme that maybe some people in the traditional art scene don't resonate with, but then I've got this tone of like whimsy and joy and brightness that other people might not connect with. Did you ever feel homeless, or were you just like, hey, this is my journey and it's going to take me wherever it goes?
Yeah, it depends on the day. I mean, you could ask me that even now. I mean, along the way, I've had these moments where I've just found the pocket of people that get it. And then other times where it seems to miss. Um, and I don't always want to blame that on the audience. Sometimes maybe the art's just not as solid as it needed to be in that situation. I don't know. But certainly all the things we're talking about have been this sort of funny things I've had to navigate. I recently did a project called 40 the Gospels. And unfortunately, it was meant to be released, this exhibit and art book, in 2020. And I literally finished the project a couple of weeks after we all went into quarantine. So that was a hit against it. But I've also found, now that I've been getting out and about, amongst all the crowds, images filled with Jesus seem to be less collectible. So people are super happy to buy Noah's Ark or A Peaceful Kingdom or any number, a Psalms rendition of something, a Good Shepherd painting, perhaps. But I have found that, I haven't found a buyer for Jesus healing the leper, for instance.
What's your theory, Joel?
My theory is it's way too faith-based, even for a lot of art buyers. Like adding Jesus pushes it into the next category of that just seems to be a weird thing for people to hang on their walls. I am still working on building my audience with it after all these years with Christians. There's still not enough believers who take art, put it on in a valuable category to the point of, I am going to spend money on this. I'm going to make this a priority. So yeah, I don't know. I'm still chewing on all that one. That's been one I am unsure about. Then on the flip side, I'll go and I'll speak to a group and I'll use these images in a presentation and they resonate really well. So the disconnect right now with this project has been people really like it, but it hasn't been a financially viable project. I've got a lot of these paintings that took me months to paint sitting in my basement right now. Yeah.
Joel, so we've talked a little bit about like art as a springboard for joy and art as an avenue for worship, but you've also been able to develop a way to have this really kind of curious prophetic edge in some of your work as well. And so you're able to communicate some hard truths, even some uncomfortable truths with image in a way that a preacher might not be able to do. Talk about some of the ways that the prophetic has come into your writing, whether it's about issues that you care about, like Israel Palestine, or whether it's gun violence in schools. Pull on that thread for me a little bit.
Yeah. So I think I got two things going for me in this category. And this is an area where the last number of years, I've just felt more and more pulled into this area, trying to do things that I guess I see as important. Being an artist is too hard of a job to do just as I'm living. So to me, there has to be a deeper value to it. And this is one of the places where I found the deeper value. Two things I've got going for me, though, is one, when you have an art object, it lets you talk about an issue via the object, and it diffuses the situation. So, for instance, you brought up Israel Palestine. I painted a painting called Balancing the Peaceful Kingdom on the separation wall, which is a giant maximum security looking wall that goes around Bethlehem, as in a little town of Bethlehem. And it's a stack of the animals from Isaiah 11 trying to get over the wall. that painting has been so helpful to have conversations about the situation there. A, people find out there's a big wall that some people don't know is there. And then B, they're like, well, why is the wall? And a lot of people may know more of the Israeli reasons for the wall and maybe not the hardship of the Palestinians or the Palestinian viewpoint. They also might not know that the Christian enclave of that part of the world is on the wrong side of the wall, right? So it's like, what's going on here? But the bottom line is, it's a very complicated place. That wall just is not helping. It might help a short-term problem, but it's not helping a long-term situation. And by painting on it and by painting a peace image on it, it's allowed me to have all these discussions with folks about what's going on there. So art acts as this object that lets you talk about the object, about the image, and somehow create civil discourse. I don't know why, but it just seems to. Another thing I think I have going for me in some of my work is this kid-like approach. Mm-hmm. So when I write text, as I often do on my images from a kid viewpoint, it just somehow gives you license to say some things, because kids just say what they see, right? So if a kid makes a comment about, for instance, in the story of the Good Samaritan, who the other is, they're going to include everybody in that. Like, they'll just start making a list of everyone that they think might be different, right? So who's my neighbor? Well, this huge long list, which in the painting I did recently of that, the Good Samaritan has this piece of paper coming out their pocket with this huge list of things. And I think a lot of us, even those who really want to serve our neighbor, might pick and choose who's on that list, right? Even a little bit, just a tiny bit. But kids don't. They just say it as they see it. So that's given me some real ability there. And then the final one I'll get at is some of these take place in situations that are almost performative. So for instance, after the horrible Valentine's Day shooting in Florida several years ago, and when youth were rising up and doing these marches and whatnot, there was one that took place in East Lansing, in Lansing, Michigan, our capital. And I had an idea, so I reached out to the teenagers who were organizing it, and I brought some teenagers from here, a young girl, especially from my youth group, who was really fired up about these things. And I had painted a big automatic weapon on a board and had it at the Capitol steps. And I got up and just basically said who I was as an artist, but said, hey, I'd like you to hear from my friend Ava, who then got up and gave this beautiful speech of, can't do it with one, but one can turn to two, can turn to four, can turn to, just started this multiplying. And then she took some paint and she wrote her name on this board. And then we put this easel at the base of the steps. And then people came up and they wrote their names in paint. And it turned into this beautiful, it almost looked like waves. It was like water of graffiti. And it turned into this beautiful painting, and it obliterated this automatic weapon. And it was just a sort of a beautiful thing to do that day. And we had an object at the end. And again, it gives you a chance to talk about specifically automatic weapons, right? So I have lots of people in my life who are hunters and gun owners and super responsible. And like most Americans, believe that there should be limits on who can get their hands on certain things. And there should be background checks and all these sort of things that are just, they're not crazy, we're coming for your guns, sort of political statements. They're just like sort of common sense things for safety. And that art has allowed me to step into that conversation. And again, because as art helped diffuse the conversation while we're having it, some of these topics can go sideways really fast with folks.
Yeah. I love that you talked about the performative aspect, because, and you and I have had this conversation before, but when you read the book of Jeremiah and you read the book of Ezekiel, both of those guys are trying to communicate really hard messages, but they're using images or performative art to do it. They're using a pot or a linen belt or a clay model of the city or all these other things to be able to say, like, instead of just coming right out and punching people in the face with a message, they're like, hey, let me show you a picture.
Yeah, they're artists. They're absolutely artists. which, as you mentioned, these prophets, I feel like one of the things I want to say about prophetic, because it's funny when you talk about prophets and you're saying you're doing prophetic art, it's like, I don't quite mean that I'm a prophet, but what I mean, when I talk about prophetic, and I'd be interested in your definition of it, but it's just being a truth teller.
Sure.
Being saying truth and saying truth as you hope the kingdom would see it.
Yeah, I grew up in a charismatic tradition, and sometimes prophetic meant that you were somebody who could like tell the future or like have a very specific word from God about a very specific situation. When I use it generically, prophets, they're alignment experts. they point out like where the arc of truth is going and where the current arc of reality is headed, and then they identify the gap. And they say, this is the gold standard, and this is what we've settled for, or this is the plumb line. Like, this is what something that is truly level. And this thing that we're living right now, it's not level. And there's not necessarily shame to it. There's just hey, this is not as God intended.
Yeah.
This isn't the behavior, or this isn't the verbiage, or this is violence that is out of scope and out of step with who God is and what God cares about. And the prophet always ends with a question, which is, so what are you going to do?
Yeah.
So it's empowering in that regard.
I love that.
We talk about how you continue to keep that press for joy and light and childlike wonder in the midst of a world where we're just constantly bombarded with things that are horrifying or intense or anxiety inducing and dark. What does that quest look like for you?
Yeah. So again, I think I'm going to answer this in two ways. The first one is, I think I pursue it naturally because it's, I actually do a whole talk. Sometime we'll have to do this one on comparing spiritual disciplines to artistic disciplines. So many of the things line up, but creative practices are, you could think of them as disciplines. And I participate in these disciplines every day. Today, I was painting an image. I actually worked on some images of a prodigal son painting and an image of Jesus walking on water. So I was thinking about these things today. So I was thinking about faith things today, but I was also thinking about the technical things and the certain concentrations and space I need to be in to just make things. So, but these are things I participate in every day. And so I've been on this trajectory, and so it takes a lot to knock me off the trajectory.
Okay.
So the first part is I continue to do it because that is how I'm wired, but also I do it in practice. Like I happen to be someone who really loves church, which not everyone does these days, it seems. Lots of folks look to different places for spiritual fulfillment, and I find the rhythms that are almost forced upon me from being a regular churchgoer are really helpful to me. A place that you have to show up and do these things, and you're exposed to these things. So the first thing is, I believe in these practices. The second part is a little more complicated. So these hard things come, and you have to ask yourself then, what are you going to do about it? Right? Am I going to go tribal like so many people seem to be going? Am I going to try to yell the loudest as so many people seem to be doing? What are my choices here, and how do I engage? And so I make a choice to engage with hard things through bright things, through joyful. And sometimes that is hard, but it's a conscious choice. I'm currently working on a project, a series of paintings that looks at threats to biodiversity. I believe in God's creation, and I think we're supposed to protect it. That's part of my worldview. And as I read more and more and learn more and more, it's a really hard show to do. It's a really hard thing to do. But I choose to keep going because I think it's an important topic. And like every other topic, I'm presenting it in a whimsical way. So that's how I tell stories.
So helpful. Joel, not too long ago, I mean, it feels like it was a long time ago, but not all that long ago, you partnered with Winning at Home and Dr. Emily DeYoung to do a book that is going to be coming out later this year, probably fall. called Peanut Butter Pie. Talk about that journey and what that process was like for you.
Yeah. So this gives me a chance to tell you, one of my philosophies of art is that art communicates. So, I mean, I believe that we read images. And so I love doing books because you've got the words, but you also have the pictures to tell these stories. And so what's fun for me as an artist, as an illustrator, is to work with experts like Emily. They come with these ideas that I may or may not know anything about, and I get to learn about them. And then my job gets to be, how can I help tell this story in a way that makes sense? And how can the pictures help it make sense?
Yeah.
So I'll just give one little bit away. Early on in reading the first draft of it, there were these images of sort of this dripping of anxiety, this drip, drip, drip of anxiety, and how that drip grows. And so quickly my mind went to a drip that turns to this trickle, to a stream, to a raging river, and how that can really show, and you get swept away by that river. It's just a good image of anxiety overtaking you, and that I think we can all relate to. But then you can look at the picture or the pictures, and it just makes sense. I think. I hope it does. I hope it's helpful. But so that was a really cool experience for me to take new information and just to try to come alongside it and make it communicate even more clearly.
So good, Joel. I love what you did with that book, because I think one of the powerful dimensions of your art is that childlike does not translate into childish, right? So it transcends age groups. So just because it can be really compelling and bright and fun for a 7-year-old doesn't mean that it doesn't connect with a 70-year-old as well. And there, again, not to give too much away, but there are images from that book that like are seared forever into my brain that are super helpful as I try to process the things that Dr. Emily was trying to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Joel, what do you say to people who are wired creatively and aren't sure what to do with it? Like if they say, well, I can't monetize this, or I can't like use it in worship as church, but I have this burn to create and I don't know where to go with it. What do you say to people who feel like their passion may be undernourished and doesn't seem like it has a practical, in air quotes, outlet?
So the first thing is you got to take the practical out to begin with. Now, I say that as a guy that has to think about the practical because it's literally how I make my living. That said, you got to take the practical out and know that there's helpfulness to it anyway. Doing creative things is helpful. Again, I do a whole talk on Genesis 1 being made in the image of God. And by the end of Genesis 1, all you know so far about being made in God's image is that God's creative and God's relational is how I synthesize it. It's like, we're told we have characteristics of God, but what do we know what those are? And we know one of them is that God's creative. So I think when we do creative things, you are living into your image bearing. And so for people listening right now, if you got an inclination to do it, that's the right inclination. You should be doing creative things because that's how God made you. So there's my soapbox. But then the practical piece of it is, I think you need space and you need time, and it needs to be regular. So space, you need to have somewhere set out in your general world that you can go to do whatever your creative thing is. And all the better if it isn't a thing that you have to get a bunch of stuff out for every time. If you can have a permanent space, even if it's a corner, it takes away a barrier. And then you just need to do it regularly. It just has to be a thing that you get in the habit of, like any other habit. I've met a few too many people who have a great idea for a novel or a screenplay or, the next whatever. And then I'll ask them, it's like, well, how far are you on it yet? And they're like, well, I haven't started. And it's like, well, that's not helpful. because by the way, your first draft is going to be terrible. Right. You got to get going. And so time, space, but the bottom line to me is you do it because that's you living into your image bearing of God. I mean, that's one of the pieces of bearing God's image is doing creative things. That's my humble opinion. I'm not a theologian. Steve, you're better trained than I am, but does that line up theologically with you?
It does. And I'm reading a book right now. It's called Glittering Vices, A New Look at the 7 Deadly Sins and Their Remedies. And she says that sloth is not ultimately a commitment to laziness. Sloth is a denial to step into the adventure for which God has called us.
Oh, I like that one.
So the enemy, like the enemy of at the root of sloth is a refusal to love, not a commitment to comfort. And she's got some big word for it that I can't even pronounce, but she says, I realized that at a point in my life, I had gotten committed to small making, like that I was making my life and my call and my contribution small. And I think that sometimes we say that we don't want to create because we're afraid to fail, or we don't want to do the work of doing multiple drafts. Like I got stuck in this as a writer. Like I would write stuff and I would send it to an editor. I'm like, this is gold. Let it be awesome. And they'd be like, yeah, you're going to need to write 3 more drafts. And then literally I would flinch and be like, I don't know if I want to. Well, that's just that's fear and that's pride. And it's a refusal to love. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
People will say if the craft is saying something meaningful, then it's worth doing the work. I've got a Harlan Corbin, the novelist. I've got a quote of his that my sister, who's an editor, sent me. It's hanging over my writing desk at home, and it says, "You can fix bad words. You can't fix no words." And so it's like just do it. And if it's as easy as writing, like I think it was Madeline Langle who said, like, if all you can write is a sentence a day, write a sentence a day. And more often than not, you won't be able to stop at one sentence, right? Because it's hard to get any rhythm after one sentence. And same thing for you. It's like, all right, I'm gonna do 5 minutes. I'm gonna do 20 strokes, like whatever it is. I'm gonna do X number of sketches.
Madeline Lingle also writes about how the real inspiration happens within the process. So she rages against the idea of sitting around and waiting for inspiration before you begin. She's like, no, inspiration happens while you are doing it. And so I've learned personally that sometimes I need to do something really simple to start out. If I'm not feeling it on any given day, I do a creative task that I know I can tackle and I can tackle well. And then as I'm going and I start getting in the rhythm, then I can start doing more complicated creative things.
Right, but we hear these hero myths, right? Like about Michelangelo's the David, and there's the rumor that like it was that he saw or Da Vinci or whatever it was, that like I could see it in the block, note perfect, and all I had to do was carve away everything that wasn't that, and we're like, oh my gosh, that's how art works. And for you to be able to say like, no, you like. I had a buddy who told me once, he's like, never fall in love with the line. Like, just hold it all loosely because you don't know what it's going to turn into. Like the only book that I ever wrote, we thought it was going to be one thing. And I got 2 chapters in and the editor is like, this is something completely different. It's as good. In fact, it might be even better because you're more excited about it. But we needed to get 5,000 words into it to actually get a pulse on where it was really headed. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. Yep. Total sense. Got to do it. We'll go back around to what you said. It's like, you just got to do it. So, and it can take any form. Creativity can take all sorts of forms. You don't have to aspire to be one thing necessarily. It's the just act of being creative that you need to aspire to.
Yeah, I mean, look at both Joseph and Daniel. Like, who were those guys? They're governmental administrators, but they were creative governmental administrators, and the processes that they created helped advance structures and save people's lives. And so I think that you're right. Sometimes if our understanding of creativity is too narrow, we'll stop short of all that it is that God wants us to reflect about His wiring and God's glory in our lives and in our work.
That's good.
Joel, thanks a ton for your time. If people want to learn more about your art, where can they go? If somebody wants to buy one of your 40 paintings, where do they go?
So the 2 best methods these days, one is JoelSchoonTanisGallery.com. That's a big one. JoelSchoonTanisGallery.com. And the other would be Joel Schoon Tanis Art on Instagram. So Instagram, Joel Schoon Tanis Art. If you start putting my name in, it'll pop up on the Google. I've had different websites, and you can. I've never been one of those people that Googles themselves to see what's out there, but one of my daughters did recently. So I'm like, I think I should see what is there anything funny out there? And it nothing funny fishy, but it is funny that like random newspaper articles or things that I might be quoted in, or just these like, oh, how did this pop up this high? Pretty high up in those things. You can find those main sources if you put my name in. But really, Instagram and that one website are the best options these days. I think I still have a Facebook page, but I, like so many people, have abandoned Facebook by and large, even though it still exists.
Fair enough. Well, Joel, thanks so much for your time. And again, if you're not familiar with Joel's work, I can't encourage you strongly enough to go and check it out. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to Hope Through the Hard Stuff. If you liked what you heard, please remember to subscribe to it, rate and review it, and then share it with others. Winning at Home offers hope through counseling and coaching, motivational speaking, community events, and other media resources. If you believe in what we do and want to support us in our mission, consider making a donation at winningathome.com.